This week, Michael Dalgleish from LogRhythm joins us for our feature interview today. In the enterprise security news, Sky High gets some patents. A threat intelligence vendor goes all in the channel. A web application scanning tool is integrated into the SDLC. Zero false positive virtual patching WAFs. And glimmers of hope for IT security in the enterprise. All that and more on this edition of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. This episode of Enterprise Security Weekly is brought to you by IT Pro TV, an easy, entertaining approach to online IT training. Access over 2,000 hours of up-to-date, high-quality video content live and on demand via your PC, mobile device, and more. For a free 7-day trial and 30% off the lifetime of your account, visit itpro.tv/enterprise security and use the code ES30. Gain control of cyber risk with Tenable.io, the first vulnerability management platform built for today's elastic assets like cloud, containers, and web apps. Discover a fresh, asset-based approach that prioritizes vulnerabilities while seamlessly integrating into your environment. And improve ROI with the first elastic licensing approach based on assets, not IP addresses. Tenable.io delivers the data and context you need to secure your elastic attack surface. Start your free Tenable.io trial today by visiting Tenable.io. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode 37 for March 16th, 2017. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, on the lines via Skype, returning from his fresh vacation in Hawaii. Mr. John Strand, welcome back, John.
Hey, and what exactly have you done to me this week with the news stories? All right, we'll get to that later.
We'll get to that. Hopefully you did hula dancing and pig roasting and surfing and all that.
Pig roasting and the surfing and the bodyboarding and lots
drinks?
of driving. Lots of tiki drinks too.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, it's not as fabulous in the security news this week, but we do have
fantastic.
We do have a couple of quick announcements before we get into our interview. The 10th anniversary edition of Source Boston is being held this April, including training sessions on the 24th through the 25th, and conference talks on April 26th through the 27th, featuring awesome speakers from our security community. They actually accepted my talk as well. I'll be talking about IoT, nightmares, and how to sleep at night. So that should be fun. Events are going to take place in Boston at the Courtyard Marriott downtown, and Security Weekly listeners get a $100 discount on either the training or conference passes when you use the discount code, not the security code, the discount code Security Weekly. Visit sourceconference.com for more information. Looking forward to that one. InfoSec World 2017 is being held April 3rd through the 5th at the Omni Orlando Resort at Champions Gate in Orlando, Florida. Security Weekly listeners get 10% off that conference when they use the discount code OS17-SW. Hear talks from Kevin Johnson, Rich Mogul, Cory Doctorow, and more. Visit infosecworld.misty.com to register today. Our special guest today is Michael Dalgleish, an industry veteran spending the last 15 years deeply entrenched in the network and security world. At LogRhythm, Michael has worked with and built a team of security professionals who are growing strategic relationships with their partner and community customers. When not on the road evangelizing security intelligence and SIM, Michael spends the majority of his time learning about the latest attack vectors, kill chains, and advanced evasion techniques. Michael, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Paul.
So, Michael, I wanted to start off by talking about the market that LogRhythm is targeting and talk about the difference between, or the similarities between, what we call security intelligence and SIM.
Okay. So the market we're targeting is fairly simple: enterprise, small, medium, and emerging enterprise. There's a level of complexity with SIM natively, and I think we saw a lot of that with some of the legacy SIM platforms that are out there. So we've taken a different approach to it. There's obviously a number of reports out there that have kind of validated the ease of use of deploying a platform. So if you're looking at the difference between SIM and security intelligence, like SIM and log management in general has always been, a technology that in theory was supposed to work really great, but never leveraged properly, because if you're not actually bringing more context into the data. I know last week you guys talked about some machine data intelligence and machine learning on your episode.
Mm-hmm.
But machine learning is great, but if you're not actually adding additional security context to it, you're not actually adding proper, I guess, analysis of the data when it is in the data lake. So security intelligence is taking regular security streams, taking additional security streams from forensic sensors or whatever, and then obviously combining them to understand that data better, and then apply some discrete algorithms to that data to find the pattern of behavior that makes sense in a security industry.
One of the things that John and I talk about quite a bit actually is the number of different log sources that are out there and the different log types across all of those sources, and even specific to a particular source. The data is so unnormalized. What does LogRhythm do differently to help us normalize all that data?
Yeah, that's normalization, parsing support. So I guess the first step is processing the data, so you can receive the data in a number of different formats. And I've been active in the industry since Nortel back in the 90s. So I know there's always been people putting these calls or these requests in so that vendors would stick to a normalized data format, or at least a facility to send data, whether it's syslog or whatever. And some vendors have gone different paths and try to define different collection formats like CEF or LEAF or whatever. I think if we get past the problem and we look at a solution to the problem, is the vendor has to solve for a lot of the disparity across a lot of the log sources. So what LogRhythm's done to solve for that is they have a team. It's called LogRhythm Labs. We call it our machine data intelligence team. There's about 760 different vendors and log sources that we're continuously updating and parsing for. So when we get the data, we parse it, then we classify it out three ways, and that's security, audit, and operations. And from there, we splinter down into different paths, whether it's authentication failures or connection requests or connection denies. So
I've got to be honest, that team sounds like it like if you walked into their bay where they're working, it must be something out of Event Horizon where everyone's going crazy and there's people walking around saying they don't need eyes to see.
Yes, that poor team, they get so many requests, whether it's from current customers or prospects or even some of our OEM and alliance partners like Tenable, just trying to keep up with other vendors as they modify their outputs is pretty impressive. But I guess from our perspective, that there's some other vendors out there who do similar, functions that we do in the market, I guess, from security intelligence and data aggregation. But they rely on community-driven projects to do the classification for them, and it's kind of your mileage will vary, right? Which is why we've invested pretty heavily in this MDI team.
If you're working for an enterprise today and you had to advise someone on how to prioritize and tune your different log sources, like what advice do you have for people? Obviously, there's two ends of the spectrum, right? There's log everything and log nothing. Most people fall somewhere in between, and the devil's in the details when you're in between, right? So where do you guide people on focusing?
Focus on high fidelity sources first, right? So if you're looking at atypical attack pattern, and John, you know this from your work at Black Hills, I actually spent some time with your guys at a couple B-Sides events down in Orlando, on the UCF campus. But if you look at any atypical attack pattern, a lot of the focus is on user behavior, right? There's other indicators within a network. We're not going to talk about IOC data, but just indicators that there might be long-running sessions or whatever. Network indicators are fine, but the users are specific interests because you can model a user's behavior. People don't change much. And when they do change, that's when you should be able to understand that change in how they're accessing data, how they're transferring data, and just about everything they do within the environment, when they're logging in, when they're not logging in, what location they're logging from. So if you're looking for, or customers looking for specific guidance, what you really want to start with is have the customer focus on the data that's richest with user data. It could be domain controller logs, that could be CASB, like you guys have in the news about Sky High, and tying a lot of that data back together to understand the user.
So I got a question whenever we're talking about logs. This is a question I've been asking a lot of people lately. Whenever you look at the total number of event logs that a SIEM receives, what percentage of those event logs do you think actually have alerting and monitoring rules written for them? And what percentage of those logs are completely ignored and just sit in the SIEM forever?
I would say from an archive perspective, 98%. I would say you typically see anywhere between
98% are ignored, or 98% are actually have actual rules written for them.
I wouldn't say they were ignored. So it all depends on how the SIEM actually looks at the data. Well, yeah, because there's different ways different SIEMs actually look at data, right? In our instance, what we do is every log that comes in hits a processing layer, and it gets that classification, that commonality attached to it. Now, probably about 97% of that stuff will get shipped off to archives, right, and put to the side. However, it passes through the processor to look for events, specific events that the rules are hitting, to push up to what we call the platform manager. The platform manager is where AIE lives. That's the advanced intelligence engine. So AIE will process that 3%, but it also processes everything that's being indexed out to Elastic as well. So it does a second processing tier against it, because it needs to look at it to see if anything that correlates against the rule set from the actual events and then the stored data makes sense. So it's kind of a multi-pronged answer. Sorry, 3% really go up to the events area, but you can't discount the other 97%, because those events might tie into data that you don't typically assume are events too, right? So you have to actually still process that other 97%. If you just push it to the side, you're opening a lot of blind spots. That makes sense, John?
Yeah, so the majority of the logs are used basically as a reference based off the 3% that's really interesting.
Yeah, because if you have that 3% that's interesting and you have rules that are looking for that indicator, it can cross-reference back to that other 97% to see if there's another indicator inside of an attack chain or a pattern that you've created.
What's the best source for endpoint information? Does LogRhythm have an agent or integrate with other agents to pull some of that endpoint information back? I think traditionally when we look at SIEM, we think about, well, yeah, I'm going to grab all my syslog, I'm going to grab all my Windows logs, I'm going to grab some network logs. And I think for a long time there was a gap on the endpoint. I think that gap is closing, and I think as a community we're getting better at processing some of those logs. How does LogRhythm do it?
A couple different ways, right? There's Windows event logs, which are probably the oldest way to do it, looking at event IDs. The LogRhythm also has what we call an endpoint sensor. The endpoint sensor performs a couple of different functions, everything from process monitoring to file integrity monitoring, registry monitoring, and network connection monitoring. So as network connections are built up, users log in, that endpoint sensor can also send the data back up to the SIEM. That doesn't preclude the ability to integrate or work with folks like Carbon Black or Cylance or some of the other newer players in the endpoint market. We're not in the at least in the response area at the endpoint side or the active protection area. It's more of a forensic data generation at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on that note, we see a lot of these companies that are trying to push very, very hard. If you're looking at Carbon Black, it's not just protection of the endpoint. They're also trying to get into that automated incident response. And there's a bunch of vendors that are doing that as well. Sentinel-1 would be another one. It seems like with you guys, you're kind of focusing on what you do and what you do best, and you're not trying to take those steps into trying to be an incident response management platform. You're just trying to take the steps into doing endpoint protection and automated incident response. How do you actually look at the market moving forward over the next, let's say, 18 to 24 months? Is that something that's going to play out well for these different vendors that are trying to be absolutely everything, or do you think it's better to try to stay true to what you do rather than trying to jump into absolutely everything?
I think we're in March right now, and we've got about 3 months before the maintenance and the acquisition season, merger and acquisition season starts. So I think there are a lot of these newer endpoint vendors. We saw it with Carbon Black and Confer, right? But some of these smaller guys, Sentinel One and a couple other folks, they might get snatched up by the big boys. I have no idea. I have no inside knowledge, just so you know. I'm just speculating that we're going to see.
I think
some
it's a safe.
point technology.
I think it's a safe I think it's very safe speculation, because that's what most of these companies want at the end of the day, is to get bought up for millions of dollars.
Which is why they're coming out of the woodwork, right? I mean, I think there's been 12 new endpoint vendors just in Boston alone in the last year and a half. So it's
just
pretty
really that many, and wow, okay.
Yeah, I think there's over 40 total, from what I'm told.
Cyber Reason, Aveco is Great Britain based, but they opened a Boston based office. Cyber Reason's local in Boston, Israeli company. Confer was a Boston based company. Carbon Black was a Boston based company. Well, not Carbon Black, but Bit9, when it originally was a Boston based company. There's so many companies just popping up here on the East Coast. And they are looking for a pretty nice exit, right? Great technology stacks. They're doing stuff with technology that we couldn't have done about 5 years ago in the endpoint space. On the SIM space, I think to answer your question about incident response, so LogRhythm does do incident response. I don't know if we've talked about it on your show before, but we do what we call threat lifecycle management. It's a great marketing word for, we do case management and some incident response and some orchestration. And the orchestration is typically leveraging other tools, right? So anything that we integrate with, whether it's a Palo Alto or Carbon Black, leveraging their APIs to take response against stuff. But there's case management built into it. We don't see ourselves replacing traditional case management systems or ticketing systems internally. It's more for, and John, you should know this, when you are doing a red team test or whatever, and it's a long stretch, you guys are doing 30 days or however, if you do have some persistence in the network, one of the things you're looking for is anybody who's on IM or sending emails or messages across the network saying that there's something weird going on, or they've been hacked or whatever, right? And the best way, after you set up your sniffers inside of the network, if somebody in a ticketing system that's not using a secure channel sends a message, an IT guy to another IT guy saying, I think this asset might be broken into, I mean, that's a flag for you as a red team to move and either maintain your persistence or move on somewhere else.
No, it's at that time that you jump in the middle of the communication and say, yes, you have been hacked.
Put up a false flag.
Yeah. Congratulations, sir. You caught us. Well done.
So what we really envision our case management platform is you take the security investigation and incident response away from your typical IT folks and you leverage it inside the platform where all the log data and all the the data that you're going to have to maintain chain of custody for lives, right? That way you don't have an IT guy saying we've been hacked or breached, and then that goes into a whole different spectrum when you're talking about cyber insurance and defining a security incident versus a breach, right? So you don't want your guys who aren't security guys to touch that data inside of their IT ticketing system. Leave it inside of the security appliance and then offload it when you're ready to call it a breach and hit your 30-day window to report it or however your state laws or federal laws work.
So, Michael, with some of the latest attack vectors that are out there, it says in your bio, you follow the latest attack vectors, and you mentioned listen to the show. We try and follow the latest attack vectors as well. What are some of the wins that you're seeing, across your customer base where you're like, wow, like that was a relatively new attack vector, and we handled it well, and our customers love us for it?
I don't know if it's a new attack vector. It's just an evolution of vectors. I mean, the human vector is always still the weakest. Spear phishing is still the same. They're just using different exploits, or they're using different techniques. I think the big thing 3 or 4 years ago was one letter off domains was pretty cool. People couldn't tell the difference, and it hasn't changed much. I think the phishing is getting better. The attackers aren't 15-year-olds living in Eastern Europe anymore. They're 20 or 30, and they can speak and write English intelligently now. So they're drafting emails and web pages that are actually a lot closer to what makes sense for somebody to understand in a spear phishing email. I think what's cool is the evasion techniques have gotten better over the last couple of years. There's in-memory techniques. There's other ways. So just, I guess, background. I worked at an endpoint vendor Some on LinkedIn profile. I don't want to drop names. I worked at an endpoint vendor for about 6 years, and we did just about everything from using only debug to IDA Pro and stuff to understand how malware was working. And one of the things that was pretty nifty about it is on the heuristics engine. We're talking about an AV vendor from 6 years ago. A couple of different ways they did bypasses were, just typical Windows API calls like sleep or wait for multiple objects, and those techniques are pretty depreciated now because a lot of vendors have built-in detection techniques for that. Like I know FireEye has already, but it's still interesting the evolution of these techniques. So from my experience with our customers, the biggest problem right now was, and I know everybody talks about it, and I hate talking about it, is ransomware. Ransomware through spear phishing. And it's such an easy thing to do, and there's like 20 different ransomware kits out there. So it's not really sexy to talk about, but it's one of the biggest problems that companies are facing right now. They don't want to have their assets locked up and encrypted, especially if they're not running proper backups.
Yeah, I really feel that ransomware has done more to further the state of computer security than any compliance document that's ever come down the line, just because it's immediate and visceral, and like management understands it. It's not this weird idea of a teenager in a basement trying to hack. It's something that happens, and it immediately has painful impact. And for that, I thank the people behind ransomware.
Yeah, they've done a lot to further the cause. Even the board members and the C-level guys at a lot of our customers and partners are pretty in tune with ransomware and some of the indicators. So you're right. It's been interesting to us in the industry.
Well, I think you bring up a great point, Michael. I think in general, from what I've experienced, is the C-level, the CISO and the CIO especially are very much in tune with what's going on in our world, more so than ever before. Do you experience that today, and how does that change your conversations when you're talking with C-levels?
Budget. Budget. I mean, they're actually allocating budget for defensive tools and obviously detection tools as well now. It used to be where you would just get drawn into a battle. And like I said, I spent 6 years on the endpoint side, and the endpoint side was not sexy 6 years ago. You didn't have the silences or the carbon blacks or anybody else out there back then. So there was always a battle for budget, and everything was kind of commoditized, and you were battling their budget for infrastructure and virtualization infrastructure, right? You were battling for mindshare against VMware and Citrix and all these virtualization players who were talking about data centers. This is before the cloud apocalypse, right? So budget was a big problem. There was no delineation between IT budget, infrastructure budget, and security budget. So we've seen an increase in spending. Everybody's talking about it, but I mean, even John, you folks over at Black Hills are able to leverage a lot of that budget now because people understand that they need to test their security practices. They need to have proper policies. They need to get cyber insurance. They're more willing to talk to a group of folks who can do some red teaming or purple teaming on their environments and spend the money.
So tell us about kill chains.
What do you want to know about kill chains?
Well,
like a question.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a strange, almost a buzzwordy kind of term. But from what I understand, LogRhythms products in the space that you play in, you can absolutely help identify some of those. Yeah.
I know it's a prehistoric term, man, and it was coined by the U.S. Air Force a long, long time ago, and now it's become really buzzwordy. If you would have said it 10 years ago, nobody would have paid attention to you. So from a kill chain perspective, if you're looking at initial reconnaissance to the initial compromise to lateral movement through the network to exfiltration, each of those, I guess from a kill chain perspective, each of those sections or parts have different indicators within it. And if we're talking about log source and context of those log sources, you can see that activity typically in an environment. So I'll take you through something simple. While you get an email from John, obviously you think it's from John with a PDF, your browser crashes or whatever, and you're exploited. The reception of that email goes through your, if you're using Office 365 or Exchange, right? It's got a one letter off domain. That right there is an indicator, right? If that's coming through the log message and you're parsing out the message store for Exchange, you should be able to see that the sender address is different from the message tracking address, right? So that in itself should bubble up and be a risky event. So that obviously from the initial compromise would show up. The second point to that would be if you're an attacker and you want to maintain persistence, Paul, I'm the attacker. I'm now in your environment. I'm not going to use your account to do a lot, right? What I'm probably going to use your account for is to create a secondary account or a tertiary account. Use that secondary account to then either run scans or run Mimikatz, dump some hashes, and then try to move laterally across the network to something that makes sense. That in itself generate a ton of logs, right? Mimikatz, that process should generate logs if you're using a proper endpoint sensor. You creating another account and then deleting it within a couple hours because you used it to run Mimikatz should generate some type of alert. And then data exfiltration, or in ransomware's case, the disabling of LSAS and shadow copy services, and then massive file encryption or a slow and low transfer outside of the network, where you've got a long run-in session that's only transferring at 5 bytes or 5 kilobytes a second. So there's different areas where inside of the kill chain where it's generating log data, but you have to understand where to look for it, or you have to have a system that can look for those indicators and then understand those indicators.
So how much of it falls on the user to know what those attack points are and what those different points in the kill chain, for lack of a better term, are, versus what's automatically inside of the product that it's detecting without me, the user, having to train it?
Well, if you're using a competitor's product, you have to train it.
Yeah.
I want to talk more about our labs team, just because I think they're fantastic. They're headed up by James Carter. I don't know if you guys ever talked to James.
Not yet.
James, no? Oh, okay. So James ran the security practice at Mayo Clinic for a long time. After Mayo Clinic, he came over to take over as CISO and run our labs team. So labs team is split up into two different groups, right? We have the MDI team that does all the processing, contextualization against all the logs. But we also have our security team. The security team is, and that's headed up by Greg Foss and a couple folks. I think you guys have spoken with Greg a couple times.
We love Greg. Greg and I go way back.
I love Greg. So Greg has a bunch of folks working with him. What they do is they look at the latest techniques being used in the industry, and they start building concrete rule sets that look for it inside of our products. So they actually build our rule blocks and some of the learning blocks against that. So they've rolled out our ransomware rule blocks. They've rolled out a number of our UEBA and network-based anomaly detection rule blocks. They also run, their own purple team testing against us internally. We have a heavy sales organization, right? We're a startup that's been around for 12 years. So, we have 200 or 300 sales and sales engineers and sales support staff. So they, Greg and his team is constantly testing our own people, because anybody who's got about 600-700 people is typically going to look like another company or customer, right? So vendors who aren't testing themselves and have a team that are testing themselves and then putting that into practice in their product are doing themselves a disservice.
And I do want to say, as LogRhythm's been a sponsor for a while, just full disclosure, but what I've gathered from speaking with people from LogRhythm along the lines of the labs folks, for example, everyone seems really happy. Like LogRhythm seems like a really cool place to work. Like you guys have
They actually let one of their people come to episode 500 and drink with us all day long. That's usually a sign of a cooler company.
Well, not only that, it seems like the culture, that startup culture, still exists at LogRhythm, to your point, Michael. And Greg and others have described how they have the competitions where you go develop something cool on company time, and then you talk about all the cool things, and some of those cool things become products. Like, it just, everyone that comes on from LogRhythm really seems like they enjoy working there, which speaks to your labs team. They're out there having fun and doing their thing, but they're actually having an impact both inside the product and for customers as well. And that can be a difficult thing to sustain over time.
Oh, yeah.
But a lot of people I talk to at LogRhythm are like, I've been here for 5 years or more. So that's really cool.
I came here about 3.5 years ago. There's about 200 people, and we're pushing past 650 now. I had the same concern, right? I thought, 200 people, it's not that big yet. It's still scrappy. It's out of Boulder, Colorado, so they're a little more loose. but we, I don't know, in 3.5 years, not much has changed from a culture perspective.
Yeah, that's
Product's
awesome.
gotten better. People are, they've hired some pretty cool people. Greg was one of the best pickups we got. He's awesome.
Absolutely. John, more questions for Michael?
Nope, I'm good. But we gotta. I'd like to get them on and talk more about the automation, the kind of the incident response stuff, because that's clearly something that we haven't been talking about. And to be honest, it's such a big area. It's probably something we need to talk about the other vendors in the space and what's happening, because it is a huge movement right now. Everyone's trying to be that single pane of glass that does everything, and it should be something we should bring them on again.
It's a new buzzword: security automation, orchestration. Right? Everybody's talking about it.
Orchestration, what is it? CASB. Gotta love CASB. That's a new buzzword. That's a fun one.
And through a single pane of glass. That's very important.
Single pane of glass.
That's right. The operative word there. Well, Michael, thank you very much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly. It was nice having you. We'll be right back with the Enterprise Security News. Stay tuned.